Happy Easter. Well, as everybody knows, we are just broadcasting here with a skeleton crew of 7. So we are well within the guidelines of social distancing and 10 and less meeting together. But our skeleton crew is here, and they are dedicating themselves to whatever the need is. And so the need today is making sure that our recording equipment is working and being televised, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all of you being here. So this morning I'm going to talk about the 7 steps of resurrection, but I'd like to start with a really timely quote by Helena Rourke. And she was responding to one of her students, a question they had asked about Easter. This is what she wrote. She said, "I was so happy to receive the letters from my distant co-workers. We are all united by the same teaching, and we should feel like one big family." Now, how timely is this? I mean, this is why we say the teachings are ageless, the ageless wisdom. And this is certainly an example of that. We should feel like one big family, and we are all united by the same teaching. She said, while it is not yet possible to be together physically, it is good to know that such a time will come. So let us prepare ourselves for that great time. She wrote, let us look forward to the holiday of spirit and heart. We shall keep strict spiritual fast in order that we may, in complete purity of body and spirit, welcome the eve of Easter, the resurrection of the Spirit. Let us aspire in all our thoughts toward this near future, and many of the dull and difficult things of daily life will be eased, because in our hearts, she says, we will accept the unavoidable blows and difficulties as a part of a great probationership, and will live in the joy of the coming future. Is that not magnificent? I was so touched when I read that. Oh my gosh. It's like she was writing to us today. So that quote can be found in Helena Rourke's Letters, Volume 1, April 26th, 1934. So let me start by defining resurrection. Resurrection is a force in nature. You know, I'm trying not to get too informal here because the environment is so different, but I would like to just insert some ideas periodically, and starting with this. What an incredible definition for resurrection. Resurrection is a force in nature. I can guarantee you, you go on the internet, you go on to the spiritual social media sites and the internet websites and church websites and so forth, you will be lucky to find one of those sites to define resurrection in this way. But isn't it the truth? Resurrection is a force in nature. And now the teaching goes on to say this, which overcomes all the limitations of our personality. This is resurrection, the force of nature that overcomes all limitations in our personality and spiritual levels, and eventually directs us to the Spirit, directs our spirit to Shambhala, where the will of God is known. This is so inspirational. It lifts us beyond the earthly sphere, beyond the earthly environment of today. So resurrection can happen every day if we allow it to happen, because it is a force in nature. So in other words, resurrection directs our spirit to the Father. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, religions used to believe that life is eternal. And life does not die after the body passes away. This is something I think all of us in our deepest level of being knows this. But then life keeps throwing blankets that buries this understanding. So when a death occurs, and I've seemed to have had a whole number of people close to me die this last year, the last 12 months. My son, the same thing. He's had young friends die. And of course, then going through the grief and the loss and the mourning of that loss. But the teaching tells us otherwise. It's okay to miss the people we love. It's natural, it's inherent to us. But life is eternal. Life does not die after the body passes away. So this is a great vision for us to live and to actualize it in our lives. So what does resurrection as a force of nature, what does this mean? If we think about it, we're going to see that there is a deterministic force in nature where our divine spark, which was in the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, it forged ahead. And eventually built a more complicated and fantastic forms and mechanisms for it to express itself through. Eventually, our spark arrived in the human kingdom. But the good news is that it's not going to stop there. So this is such good news. We will not stop there. We are going to enter into the superhuman kingdom. And this is what discipleship is about. We will resurrect and enter into the superhuman kingdoms. But how are we going to do this? So the teaching gives us some hints. One is meditation. Meditation is a way to resurrect our personality life and to then enter into the superhuman kingdoms, spiritual disciplines. The Agni Yoga teaching, if you read through all of those books and you then study the life of Nicholas Roerich and study the life of Helena Roerich, you will see that the spiritual disciplines that are all suggested and all written about and taught through Master Moria is exemplified through the lives of Nicholas and Helena Roerich, and also their two sons, and then exemplified through their students, through those original members that when they gathered together, there wasn't even an Agni Yoga society. But eventually there became an Agni Yoga society based on these students that were living examples of spiritual disciplines written about in Agni Yoga, such as goodwill, such as sacrificial service, such as living a life of sacrificial service. So we are going to expand our consciousness in such a way that our consciousness is going to include greater spheres of light. It was like the lecture from last Sunday talking about creative living. If we are going to live creatively, we are told, then that means we're going to recreate ourselves. And if we are going to recreate ourselves, that's when our consciousness is going to expand and we're going to move into greater spheres of light and beauty. This is resurrection. This is what today is all about for disciples, for initiates that are on a journey to bring these spheres of light and beauty into the world today. We have people on the planet today who are resurrected. We have to remind ourselves this. There are people on the planet today who are resurrected. This means that they have conquered their physical, their emotional, their mental bodies, and all their limitations, and eventually became free people. Freedom is one of the pillars of the teaching of Agni Yoga. Freedom. Freedom. Many disciples today hold that spiritual status as a result of living a life of certain disciplines. Now, these disciplines are foreign to the average person. Think about this. I don't have time this morning, and I don't even have an inclination to want to get into it. But to really think about these disciplines like the pillar of beauty, the pillar of freedom, the pillar of creativity. There are basically 7 pillars you're going to find throughout the Agni Yoga teaching. These pillars are spiritual disciplines that formulate how we live our life. So freedom is one of those pillars. Creativity is one of those pillars. Self-perfectment is one of those pillars. All of these pillars represent for us the path of resurrection so that we can move our consciousness into greater spheres of light, what we would call the supermundane kingdom. Freedom is the absence of interfering influences that try to control our will and to use us against our freedoms, against our own interests, and against our future well-being. That's what freedom is. And we must recognize those that are trying to interfere with our freedoms. So freedom is one of the pillars of the foundation of this group. We have the freedom to do and to be whatever we want. The teaching, in other words, does not suppress people's freedom. So write that out and put it on your mirror. And the reason I say this is because sometimes our coworkers, sometimes our friends, sometimes our family members, and people unknowingly will say, the teaching is not for us. And yet the teaching is our lifeblood. So if we understand these pillars of the teaching, and we believe in the possibility of recreating ourselves, of resurrection, then you want to be that pillar of freedom. You want your life to be an example. You want to be an exemplary. I don't think that's the right word. You want to be an example of the life that those people on the planet today are exemplifying because they have been resurrected. And so this is why we love the Rourkes so much. And other people as well. I'm just focused on the Rourkes today, I guess, because I read and know so much about them and their students. We have the freedom to do and be whatever we want, and we should not hide that belief. So resurrection means that we need to break our limitations and enter into greater freedoms, greater light, greater actualizations in our day-to-day relationships. So this is pretty practical. Resurrection is an expansion of consciousness and being present in larger areas of existence. A couple of weeks ago, I used a phrase about zooming in and zooming out. Zooming out means that our consciousness is going to be present in larger areas of existence. Zooming in means we're in prison, that we have a very small circle that represents our life. Zooming out means that circle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and presenting larger areas of existence to ourselves. So our circle of life is expanding. At least that's what we are striving to accomplish. The teaching says that the greatest trap to our freedom is the mental body. And if you need more clarification, we're talking about the lower part of the mental body. The mental body is very sneaky. That is because our thoughts are so subtle. We think we are observing our thoughts and we catch them, but then they slip by us and we're not even aware. We're not even aware. So that's why one of the greatest traps to our freedom is that lower part of, that lower aspect of our mental body. The majority of humanity is stuck there now in the lower half of the mental plane. Now, there are 7 traps, and this is the main part of the talk this morning. There are 7 traps that we must conquer in that mental plane. And this is the focus of our talk this morning. The first step or trap is called the thoughtless state of consciousness. The thoughtless state of consciousness. This is one of the 7 traps that is limiting us expanding that circle of existence. The thoughtless state of consciousness. This is a state in which a person obeys the thoughts of others. Does that not just, it's just the hair at the back of my neck, and I think I have some back there. I can't, I don't know, I just clench when I think that I would be obeying the thoughts of others, and yet I know that it is so easily done. And the reason it is so easily done is when we shut down and begin to think mechanically, and we're no longer awake, no longer aware. That's when people can control, or people's thoughts can control us. And when we act like that, we become like an automaton. So in other words, the interests of other people, their habits, their jealousies, their greed, control people, and they obey those interests just like sheep. And we certainly see this happening in the world today. We don't want to see ourselves acting like this. Such a person doesn't have a direction. So have a direction. Even if it is the wrong direction, I mean, this is where my thinking is anyway, even if it is a wrong direction, if you're dedicated to that direction, at some point it's going to put you back on target, directing you to your North Star, the purpose of your life. So be dedicated and have a sense of direction. If you don't have a sense of direction, if you don't have vision, if you don't have a purpose in your life, you're going to obey the thoughts of other people. Such individuals, those with a thoughtless state of consciousness, are very dangerous because they can be misused. They can be manipulated in any direction that others want to use them. And boy, do we not see it. Because they are thoughtless. Their human soul is chained in the mental plane and needs to be resurrected. So yes, this is what you are resurrecting. We are resurrecting our unfolding human soul. This is why for those who are striving to become initiates in their vision to serve hierarchy need to resurrect their soul from these traps of the mental plane. Typically of me, every day I go to the Facebook and I look at the comments on the Agni Yoga Community of Living Ethics, which is a Facebook site that White Mountain is sponsoring. And this very well-educated, very intelligent woman was commenting to a quote that someone had posted on the site. And she made a comment that, again, the hair went up in the back of my neck. I was so surprised. She said, "Everybody is arrogant." No, don't fall into that trap. Arrogance is found with thoughtless people. Self-confidence is the opposite of arrogance. Self-confidence with a capital S, self, should never be misunderstood as arrogance. Now I've had myself. Okay, the next trap that we must conquer. Once we catch our thoughts and start to think, to use our mind, now what happens is the spark enters into the second step. And this is an interesting step. It's called the earthly thoughts stage. The earthly thoughts stage. At this stage of the life of the soul, the person thinks only about earthly interests. For example, they think only about their body, their impulses. My husband, my son, my daughter, my house, my dog, my country. Their urges and drives are very important. Their possessions, their land and house and pleasures are very important. What happens, though, is that they become increasingly stuck to the earth. And this is a very, very, very great trap. Millions of people are stuck there. They are chained and frozen there and cannot see beyond. It is very difficult for these people to achieve resurrection. Remember, Christ said that the kingdom of God must be taken by violence. This means that we must use all of our efforts, energy, daring, courage, so that we release ourselves. We must use, I'm repeating myself, we must use all of our efforts, all of our energy, our daring and courage, so that we release ourselves, resurrect ourselves, and recreate ourselves. So how are millions of people stuck in this step? For example, you are stuck to something very beautiful. You adore it. You love it. It may be your food, your property. It may be your house. But then something comes and takes it away. In fact, isn't much of humanity going through this right now due to the pandemic? For many incarnations, things are taken away from us. Eventually we learn that earthly things and earthly thoughts are not permanent, and that they are the only sources of suffering and pain. Only the sources of suffering and pain. So that's the second step. The third step is called the stage of disintegrating thoughts. These thoughts are based on lies. Disintegrating thoughts are based on lies. When I read this in the teaching, and I thought about certainly all the lies that are coming out of the present administration, our government, it's frightening. It really is frightening. It's frightening to many of us, because this is a stage of disintegrating thoughts based on lies and hypocrisy. They are not true. They are just made up. And if we don't see it, if we don't recognize it, it puts us in that first category of being thoughtless human beings. And in being in that stage, then we're going to be controlled by these disintegrating thoughts, these lies, this hypocrisy. These kinds of thoughts are very dangerous for space. Humans think that space is polluted by fuel emissions, smog, and radioactivity, which is true, but the greatest pollution we have at present is the disintegrating thought forms in space. In other words, lies. A great one made a remark that the angelic kingdom decided to leave. This is so important, and if you'll give me just a minute. Sorry about that. We have allergies going on here. It's the season of allergies. Okay, let me go back to this. A great one made a remark that the angelic kingdom decided to leave humanity because they said, listen to this, they said they could not breathe in this air. They could not breathe in this air, in these decaying thought forms. Decaying thought forms is any kind of thought based on lies and hypocrisy and distortion. The Great One said that we cannot send our directions to humanity because they are polluted when they are passing through our spheres. See how serious this is? I remember a dear friend so many years ago said, I don't understand. I used to be able to receive thoughts. My dreams were prophetic. I would wake up in the morning so inspired that my whole day was based on the aspirations of that inspiration from her dream. She says, what's happening? Why don't I wake up with these inspirations anymore? And this is the answer. And I know some of you are going to argue with this, but I find it true myself. We cannot send, this is the Great One, we cannot send our directions to humanity because they are polluted when they are passing through our spheres. In other words, the subjective world. But I also believe, perhaps this is something to argue with too, but I truly believe there are so many disciples, so many aspirants, so many disciples, so many initiates on the planet today that the light, the illumination that we're carrying on this planet, carrying on this planet, is cleaning it up. So we're not doomed. This is almost a subtle gift that we have to recognize that's going on. It's like someone said the other day on the news channel, said they've never seen Los Angeles, California, so clean. The atmosphere so clean. If you've ever been in Los Angeles, it's like you cough your way through Los Angeles. The pollution is so heavy. And now look at it. Light, love, and power. Freedom. So the fourth step or trap is a state of ugly, criminal thoughts intentionally built for criminal purposes. These kinds of thoughts create very great distortions and distortions in the balance of space because they provide vehicles for the dark forces. These ugly criminal thoughts, intentionally built for criminal purposes, provides vehicles for the dark forces to approach humanity, and we're pushing back. Aspirants, disciples, initiates are pushing back with their light, with their virtues, with their courage, with their daring, whose life is based on these principles of beauty and joy and freedom and creativity and striving and self-perfectment and service. We're fighting back these dark forces who are trying to approach humanity and to influence humanity. In this thought world, humanity is trapped once they have started to think in hate, in anger, in fear, in greed and jealousy. Their thoughts are very, very powerful emanations of poison. These poisons not only create a black sphere around the person, but also around the planet. The beneficial forces and energies, when they are trying to penetrate into the human kingdom and lead them from darkness to light, meet impossibilities. Sometimes it is impossible to penetrate into that darkness. Now, let me give you an example, because I know, again, this is an argumentative statement, but if you have the eyes to see and the experience to recognize it, you're not going to argue with this statement that the beneficial forces and energies meet impossibility. If you have ever tried to create right relations with an individual with serious mental health problems, you know it is impossible. See, we don't like to think in terms of impossibilities. Good people don't like to think in terms of impossibilities. But the reality of it is, it's next to impossible to regenerate the light of an individual who is totally immersed in their possessions and obsessions. And this is what hierarchy and their army is dealing with. They are trying to penetrate into the human kingdom and lead them from darkness to light. So sometimes it is impossible to penetrate into that darkness. And this is why we say in the prayer to Shambhala, "Great is darkness, I follow thee." There is no other way. Either we are going to follow the master or we are going to be lost. If humanity conquered that, it would be resurrected. Humanity is trying to resurrect itself from these 4 traps. The next trap is not a trap. So let's call it a step. The fifth, 6th, and 7th steps are no longer traps, but resurrecting steps. The 5th step is thoughts inflamed by aspiration, by worship, by adoration, and by beauty. So I think this is a very interesting stage, and this is why. It is at this stage that the person, for the first time, finds him or herself. For the first time in their life, they feel that they are a human, a real human being, because their thoughts have wings. They have great aspirations, great adoration, great worship, ecstasy, and bliss. Remember that book, Happiness? And what's the next one?
Joy, bliss.
And what's the next one?
Bliss.
Happiness, joy, and bliss. These thoughts are as nourishment for the angelic kingdom. We can certainly see in illumined poets those who found themselves whose thoughts have wings. For example, Rumi, the great Sufi poet, Rumi wrote, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." Seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against love. He also wrote, "My soul is from elsewhere. I'm sure of that, and I intend to end up there." And as a side note for the crisis humanity is going through, look at what the illumined Rumi wrote. He said, "Ignore those that make you fearful and sad, that degrade you back towards disease and death." The Bhagavad Gita, the Vishnu Purana, the Upanishads all spoke about thoughts inflamed by aspirations, by worship, by adoration, by beauty. They said that our thoughts provide nourishment for that great angelic kingdom. They come and nourish themselves from our beautiful thoughts, which open like flowers. They also inspire us with their vision, with their impressions that come from the higher worlds. So that's the 5th. The 6th, next resurrecting step is beneficent thoughts. Thoughts such as, how can I help others? How can I make my life a service for humanity? For disciples, this thought is connected and fused with the plan of the hierarchy, because the plan of the hierarchy is only for the service of one humanity. You're going to ask yourself, how can I make my personality life a service for humanity so that I can uplift humanity? How can I help those who are suffering and are caught in pain? And isn't this what's happening? All over the world, it is now happening, not just in one little pocket, of one little community in one little country, but all over the world. How can we help those who are suffering and are caught in pain? How can we lift humanity so that they get out of their prisons and into resurrection, into liberation? The life of the disciple is the life of transmission of the plan of hierarchy. The life of a disciple is the life of transmission of the plan of the hierarchy. Perhaps you can write poetry like Rumi, or compose music that will attract the angelic kingdom, or create an environment that will draw them into your home, your community, or nation, or the whole field of humanity. And the seventh step eventually opens the gates for resurrection, and that gate is creative thoughts. Creative thoughts are totally related to the purpose of God, the goal of life, the purpose of life. Creative thoughts are related to the purpose of life. Isn't that interesting? So we can ask ourselves, this is not a new question, but today would be a good day to ask, why am I here? Why am I here? If you are to be resurrected, if we are going to be resurrected, then we are going to tell ourselves that we need to work harder. If we are here to manifest the highest potentials that are latent within us, then we need to work on ourselves to reveal them. If we are here to reveal the one self in every human being, in every living form, we should not wait a minute. We should not waste a minute. We need to begin to work on ourselves. And to that, Rumi's inspiration was this. He says, stop acting so small. Isn't that something? He says, stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. Wow. If we start to live in this seventh level of consciousness, we will then penetrate into the next kingdom, the superhuman kingdom. We will be resurrected from the physical, emotional, and mental levels of our personality life. We will be facing illumination, total illumination. And this is what resurrection is. It's total cosmic illumination.